yourself for the record, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Senator Stubblefield.
Purveyor of fine horse flesh.
Purveyor of fine horse flesh. Also, I train people to ride horses. I wish you'd have called me.
Yeah.
Committee, thank you for allowing me to be here today. I appreciate it. It was 2 years ago that I introduced this same resolution to this committee and passed it out of this committee. And at that time, the national debt in our country was approximately $18.5 trillion. Today, it stands at $22 trillion. And what that means is, when you look up the number of households in the United States and you divide the number of households into the national debt, it comes to about $160,000 per household. That may not mean a lot to a lot of people. They may not really take that serious. But let me tell you a little story that happened to me last week. I was at a grocery store at a self-checkout line, and I was having a few problems because of the produce aspect of it, and one of the assistants came over and was helping me. And it was a young lady in her late 20s, early 30s, and I brought up the subject of high groceries. And she said, I completely understand. She said, I have 2 children. I'm a single mom. She said, I work 2 jobs. And she said, it takes everything I can make to get by every week. And as I drove home that night from the grocery store, I began to think about a book that I had read by a freshman congressman by the name of Ken Buck from Colorado. And when I read that book, he opened it up and telling about the extravagance and the opulence and all of the money that was spent in Washington, D.C., not on infrastructure, not on military affairs, but on parties, on taking care of the congressmen and senators going to events, millions and millions of dollars. And then I got to thinking about the $17 million that was spent by our Congress on mistresses that none of us know who they are. And I thought about how much of that money that they've thrown away in Washington would have helped this young lady and millions of others all across the country who are struggling. So let me tell you, what I surmise out of all this is there is 2 values in this country. There's one for Washington and there's one for Americans. And when you look at the first sentence of the Constitution, and by the way, the founders made it very plain. When they came out and they said that the powers delegated to the federal government are to be few and defined, those delegated to the states are to be numerous and indefinite. They made it very plain that the government was supposed to remain small, not centralized, not all-powerful. When I look at the first line of the Constitution, it says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress in the United States. Now, it doesn't take a political science PhD to realize that the federal government possesses only those powers herein granted. Nowhere in the Constitution there is no grant of power in its pages of the federal government to be involved in education, health, housing, energy, foreign aid, and a host of other areas. Each of you probably have a pocket constitution. It's just a small book that's got the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in it. It's very simple. It's not very long. But if you order a Constitution from the U.S. Printing Office today, and Mr. Meckler, you can vouch for this, you will get a 2,700-page document that weighs 10 pounds. It will cost you $130, but on its spine, it does say Constitution of the United States of America. And what does that mean? It means that it has every court case that's ever been tried in the United States. And I want to do something this morning that may be a little out of line, but I want to read to you some of those court cases that are in that Constitution Not that little simple book, but that 2,700 pages. Many of the policies we live under today were imposed not by legislators, but they were imposed by a judge. Abortion on demand was instituted by judges, not legislators. In fact, the Supreme Court had to change the abortion laws in 48 states, and when they struck down the anti-abortion laws to achieve its will. I want to read to you this decision that the Supreme Court issued in 1892, just 127 years ago. No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or nation, because this is a religious people, this is a Christian nation. The court provided over 80 different historical precedents when they made that decision. Fast forward to 1962. The Supreme Court first nationally implemented the agenda of public secularism when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that from this day forward, it would be unconstitutional for a student to even pray voluntarily at school. No historical precedents were offered. Then in 1965, the court permitted prayers if they were silent. But in 1985, the Supreme Court ruled that even silent prayer was unconstitutional. I've often wondered how they could tell whether somebody was praying a silent prayer. And then the court broadened its prohibition to include Bible reading at school. And that's kind of ironic, considering the fact that Congress printed the first English translation Bible to be used in public schools. How did they arrive at all this? They used the testimony of a psychologist who stated that the reading of the Bible in school could have harmful psychological effects on a child. So now we have a super school board of education for every school district in the nation. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that allowing students to see a passive copy of the Ten Commandments at school was unconstitutional. This is their decision. If the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate, and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible state objective. Now, isn't that amazing logic? Students can't see the Ten Commandments, even if they want to, for fear that they might obey religious teachings such as don't kill, don't steal, obey your father and your mother. And finally, I want to read you one more thing. These are all things that are included in your new Constitution of the United States of America. This is a 22-word prayer that caused voluntary prayer to be taken out of public school. We acknowledge our dependence, Almighty God, Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon our parents, our teachers, and our country. That simple prayer got voluntary prayer taken out of public schools. The same number of times that the Pledge of Allegiance uses the name God are in here. 1/4 the times it's used in the Declaration of Independence. Now, those words in the Declaration that say that we are all created equal and we are all endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that to secure those rights or to protect those rights, government is instituted among men. You know what that tells me about our government? That first and foremost, the purpose of the federal government is to protect our inalienable rights, our God-given rights. That's their first objective. That's what they should be doing. They shouldn't be in the public school system, and yet they tell me if you'll just follow the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, everything will be fine. 2,700 pages. There has been a continual degradation of the Constitution for the last 100 years. I don't think there's any question that we have an out-of-control federal government. 65% of all state budgets are controlled by the federal government. If you walk down these streets today and you ask the average person, do you think our federal government is too big, too powerful, too involved in our life? 90% of them are going to say yes. And the other 10% are going to say, I don't know. And yet the founders gave us a way. They gave us an option to fix this. And I'm sure if they could be here today, they would be asking us, why aren't you using it? So these two gentlemen here, I want to introduce Senator Tom Coburn. Senator Coburn, if you want to.
I do.
Senator Coburn, if both of you would please introduce yourself to the record. Welcome to Arkansas.
For the record, my name is Tom Coburn. I'm a citizen of the state of Oklahoma. I served in the U.S. Senate for 10 years, left 2 years early because I became convinced we're not going to see our problem solved in Washington. And all you have to do is look at Washington today at the polarization of both the parties. My first 2 years in the Senate, I offered about 160 amendments. I had 127 of them passed. The last 2 years I was in Washington, 3 amendments were offered in the United States Senate. That's just the superficial symptoms of what the real problem is. Our country was designed to accentuate freedom and responsibility. And our founders recognized 4 basic principles for us to be successful. And because of those 4 basic principles were enlivened in the populace, what we saw was the greatest, most powerful generation ever come to value. Was our beginning imperfect? Absolutely. Did we have conflict over that imperfection? Yes. But with the Civil Rights Acts and the additional amendments, what happened is we solved a grievous error that couldn't be solved at our founding. But today we lack, in a great many ways, the 4 key characteristics that our founders thought were important. And they recognized those as being important because they looked at every other republic that had ever existed. And they knew that all of those had failed over fiscal issues. So what were those 4 principles? Those 4 principles were virtue first. You can't have a free society when you undermine virtue at every angle, at every corner. And that's exactly what we've done through the overreach of federal courts in our country. The second is a limited government. We have anything but a limited federal government. The 65% that the senator referred to, of your own tax dollars that are controlled by Washington, are mandated through rules and regulations in that Constitution by people who were never elected to anything, federal bureaucrats. They actually tell your schools what to do. You don't get to decide. The federal government gets to, because you take federal education money. The third area is the rule of law. And if you look around our country and see how that's being diminished and not upheld and not respected, and what the viewpoint is of younger people in our country, what you will see is we are failing on that point. Whether it be following the law on marijuana, we now have 12 states that pass that, but it's still against the law on the federal. So why don't we just take it off the books rather than make the states complicit in violating federal statutes? And yet we're not enforcing laws. So if you have laws on the books you don't enforce, then you also undermine the rule of law because it doesn't mean anything. And then finally is economic freedom. This country led the world for 201 years as the leader in economic freedom. And that's defined by the ability to resource yourself with your own energy, intellect, and pride and go accomplish something that benefits you and those that are with you. We're now number 20 in the world. And when you go back and mine into why we're number 20, it's called regulation. It's not just federal, it's state too. There's all sorts of roadblocks to keep people from actually progressing and raising their own well-being. So at the end of 10 years in the U.S. Senate, I looked around and I said, how are we going to solve these problems? And I didn't see a solution, and I don't see a solution today. Whether it's the president we have or the Congress we have, both Senate, it's not partisan. It's an actual failure to govern. And so I left early. because I thought we ought to be fixing the real problems. As a physician, I was trained to treat disease, not symptoms. And what we see Washington doing, whether it be our Congress, our executive branch, or the agencies, is they treat symptoms. And it's all about a correctness, not with common sense, but to protect the bureaucracies and the institutions, not to do what's in the best long-term interest of our country. And amazingly, our founders knew this would happen. If you go back and read what they read and what John Locke proposed, Montesquieu, and all the knowledge that they put forth as they developed our Constitution, in all the writings you see that if in fact we violate these principles, our republic won't survive. And so we now have $144 trillion in unfunded liabilities that's going to fall on our children and my grandchildren and their children. And what that really means to the millennial generation, if there's any millennials here, that's $60,000 in a decrease in standard of living over the next 50 years for your generation. Part of that's Generation X too, but then it's the generations that follow, because we've not been responsible to do the best things for our country in the long term. So the solution to that is very simple and very straightforward. Our founders put it in our Constitution and said, when you get to this point, it's time for you to exercise, where we think the power should be the strongest anyway, in the state legislatures, your responsibility to fix this errant ways of our central government. And so we have the ability to do that. And so my question is if you don't want to do that, either you don't think we have any serious problems in our country that are going to impact our future and make us a second-rate power, because that's where we're headed. Just a side note, 10 years ago, the bid-to-cover ratio on U.S. debt was 3.8. Today, it lies at 1.58. As soon as that's at 1-to-1, we won't be able to borrow money, no matter what interest rate we pay. So we see this decline, and because the world recognizes that we will not have the ability to repay both what we owe today and what's coming in terms of unfunded obligations. And the real problem is nobody in Washington wants to make hard choices. What they want to do is continue with the same. I want to be a senator. I want to be in control. I want to be a chairman. But I'm not going to take a chance. And that's why we only had 3 amendments, because neither Leader McConnell or Leader Reid wanted any of their members to be exposed to a tough vote. Well, if you're a U.S. senator, one of the things you ought to get paid for is taking tough votes and being able to explain why you voted the way you voted. And if you don't want to do that, why are you there? So the real power lies in a committee and state houses just like this one in Arkansas. Because if we're to fix the problems in front of us, we need to call a convention of states to call on the federal government to start getting its act together financially. And we can force them to do that through an amendment to the Constitution and do it in a slow way, but make them make the hard choices. And it's not hard. The Government Accountability Office recognizes at least $400 billion of stupidity and waste a year. There's another $100 billion in fraud in Medicare. There's another $60 billion in fraud in Medicaid. So there's $560 billion if you just had somebody who cared enough would go away tomorrow. But the focus is on staying in power rather than fixing our country for our kids. So our founders gave us this tool, and all we have to do is utilize it. And my answer to your committee when I'm asked, well, what are the risks? There are risks. There's no question. My question is what's your plan to fix our country if you're not willing to do the wisdom of our founders that gave us this tool to solve this very problem, which every republic in history has encountered, and they didn't have the tools to fix it. We do. So my hope is that your consideration that this will come out of this committee, and that the question you'll ask yourself is, did I do everything I could to fix this country as a state legislator? My oath, your oath, is to the U.S. Constitution. And part of that's Article 5. utilizing that to control and balance the relationships between the federal government and the state, and also the relationships between several branches of the federal government. I'm not worried about doing an Article 5 convention. I'm worried about not doing it. And with that, I'd yield back to Senator Stubblefield. By the way, I would just say that the Arkansas Republicans and Democrats alike, 68% throughout the state, support this Article 5 convention application.
Mr. Chairman, before Mr. Meckler speaks, I think we were going to have someone from the opposing, if there's someone signed up to speak against this bill, if they want to go ahead and speak, and then we'll let Mr. Meckler finish up, if that's okay with the committee.
You want to yield?
I will yield.
Okay. If y'all would step down, please, and I'll call Paul Calvert to the table, please. Mr. Calvert, if you'll turn your mic on, introduce yourself for the record, you're recognized.
We have a limitation. Hold on, make it speak right. We need to put one on. If you got that many fours, then I'll make the motion. Mr. Chair, at the proper time, I'd like to entertain a motion.
Senator Gardner.
Because of the large amount of people in the room and the limited amount of time till we have till session, I'll make a motion that we limit the debate to 5 minutes per person and hold that pretty strictly, or we won't be able to get everybody through and be able to make it in session time.
Okay. Any objection? Sir?
The general public, yes. If Senator Stubblefield wants to finish up, we can probably give him a little leeway with that in regard.
Yeah. We have a whole page of people trying to do that. And we are limited on time today. Y'all may not know that, but we go into session at 11:30. And because of the fine horse flesh that Senator Stubblefield sold, I have a doctor's appointment that I need to leave about 11. So. Anyway, we will try to limit. Mr. Calvert, please introduce yourself and you're recognized.
Yes, sir. My name is Paul Calvert. I am not representing any organization today. I'm here on my own behalf and on the behalf of citizens of Arkansas and the general public. I have two concerns today that I wish to express for why I oppose a convention to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Number one, let me first ask a question. Why are we here today discussing the possibility of changing the U.S. Constitution? We are here in large part because the judicial branch has stepped far beyond its constitutionally delegated powers by establishing itself as the top legislative body. Should we change the Constitution in the hopes that the judicial branch will have a drastic change of heart and start following its constitutional role? Let's consider a little history on how we came to have a judicial branch which has established itself as a top legislative body. The judicial branch didn't establish itself as a top legislative body all by itself. It had a lot of help from both the executive branch and some of the legislative branch failing to stop the judicial branch from trampling the Constitution. The executive branch has a duty to refuse to enforce unconstitutional rulings, and the legislative branch has a duty to impeach judges who hand down unconstitutional rulings. This concept of the judicial branch having legislative powers is not completely off the wall. Some of our predecessors who are from England and they had a system where they used the courts to develop their body of laws, which is called common law. Arkansas statutory law actually recognizes English common law as binding for issues that are not specifically addressed in our written law. In the U.S., we have a constitution that set up a legislative process that does not include the judicial branch as part of that legislative process. Congress has both the power and the responsibility to impeach judges who fail to maintain good behavior. Trashing the Constitution seems like a stark example of failure to maintain good behavior. Impeachment is the solution when judges violate the Constitution with their rulings. My second reason for opposing this is this. If I was confident that strong, upright men like Gary Stubblefield were the kind of men who would be sent as delegates, I would be far more comfortable with supporting a convention to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. But I'm not confident that strong men like Gary Stubblefield would be sent as delegates. I'm afraid that most of the delegates would be much less principled. I'm afraid the best we could hope for is a handful of solid delegates, and the rest would be individuals with moderate or left-wing ideologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Stubblefield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all respect to Mr. Calvert, Article 5 does not change the Constitution. It actually restores the Constitution to its original intent. You know, what we've witnessed in the last 70 years is probably the greatest generational theft in American history. I have 6 grandkids, and I love them more than anything in this world. And I don't want to see them grow up in a socialist society. And I don't know if you've noticed or not, but in recent years, we have been electing, by the way, we are a constitutional republic. The United States is a constitutional republic. We're not a democracy. But we are electing a lot of socialists, which is directly opposite of a constitutional republic. What happens someday if we elect a socialist president? Will we have the checks and balances in place to be able to save our country then? I would yield to Mr. Meckler.
If you would please introduce yourself for the record.
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, my name is Mark Meckler. I'm a citizen of the state of Texas. I'm the president of the Convention of States Action. My organization is the organization that's promoting this Article 5 convention all across the country. We have activists in all 50 states, approximately 3.75 million people involved. We actually have activists in every single state legislative district in the nation. I've had the honor and privilege of traveling this country for the last 5 years. Just in the last couple of years, I've been in 42 states. I have a pretty good feel for the American people at this point. I've been to big states and small states, metropolitan areas, and farm communities. And there's a commonality running through America today. And Senator Stubblefield talked a little bit about this. If you talk to folks on the street, they're pretty much sick and tired of the federal government. That's not partisan. It's not ideological. It's intrinsic to our identity as Americans. See, we're folks who believe that we were given free will by God and that we are to be self-governing citizens. That idea of self-governance runs deep in the American psyche. It goes all the way back way before the American Revolution. On this continent, we engaged in an amazing experiment in liberty. From the time we arrived at Jamestown and executed the Mayflower Compact till the American Revolution, you have approximately 158 years of self-governance, something never before seen in all of world history. Of people on a continent not united by a particular tribe or particular ethnicity, but united by an idea about freedom and self-governance. The American Revolution was fought about this idea of freedom and self-governance. And then we came to the convention in 1787, what I think is one of the most important days in American history, actually, not celebrated. September 15th, 1787, Colonel George Mason from Virginia stood and addressed the convention. It's 2 days before the end of convention. Imagine, if you will, they've been in there all summer. You know the story, locked in Independence Hall. The windows are boarded up. It's stuffy and sweaty. And 2 days before the end of convention, Mason, who said more than anybody else at the convention, stands and says they've made a terrible mistake with the document. They created a document that gave the power to the federal government, to Congress itself, to propose amendments should they deem them necessary. They hadn't given the same power to the people acting through the states. He asked the men assembled a question which I think resonates across the ages. He asked them, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? And we don't have any audio or video from that time, but if we did, I bet they laughed. Because in all of human history, we have no record of tyrannies reforming themselves, proposing to restrain their own tyranny. Madison's notes, in fact, actually pretty much tell us that they laughed, because his notes at that point say something very unusual for that convention. Men who debated everything, every comma, every period, every small point. His notes reflect in that moment, nin com. In Latin, that means no comment, no debate, no argument. Not one person in that hall stood and said, Colonel Mason, that's a ridiculous idea, giving this power to the states. In fact, they all agreed, and the record shows us that they agreed so vehemently, so totality, that there was literally no objection, and it was unanimously adopted to give the states the power to call an Article 5 convention. I think one of the most important things that's overlooked in our system of governance is that power was given to you who sit on this committee. The founders, in their wisdom, had faith in you looking forward over 200 years. Of course, they didn't know you personally, but they did know you. The reason they knew you is because they were you. Most of the people who were sitting in that room had sat on town councils and county boards, that had sat in colonial governments and state governments. They understood that governance close to the people is the best governance. They understood not that you would be angels or smarter or better people. What they understood is that you were closer to the people. You were of the people. You were responsible to your constituents. You were accountable to your constituents. And so they vested in you a unique power not given to anybody else in the federal government. You have the most power of anybody in our federal system of governance. For only you are given the power to call a convention, to propose amendments, and to ratify those amendments. It's an extraordinary power and an extraordinary responsibility. And I would argue that you, of all people, have a moral responsibility today to exercise that power. Again, the vast majority of the American people believe the federal government is out of control. It's not a partisan issue. They want power back at home. Here in Arkansas, people want you to make the decisions that affect people in Arkansas, not people in Washington, D.C. That's true for people in New York, in Illinois, New Jersey, Iowa, California, Texas, everywhere across the country. I'll close with this. Having traveled among the grassroots all across the country, I know that they support you in this endeavor. The polling shows us across the country over...
Okay, 5 minutes up.
Thank you.
Senator Hickey. Yes, sir. Okay. Senator Stubblefield.
Just closing?
We have a full list of people
Okay.
who've signed up to speak for.
I'm closed.
You're close.
Closed for the bill. Resolution.
You don't want anyone to. Okay. Senator Bond.
I don't have a question.
Okay. Senator Bond, you have a question?
Well, I just wondered, do we get questions of the sponsors at this time?
Okay. Okay.
We're ready for questions.
Senator Bond, you have a question? Senator Hickey?
Yes, and I want to vote for this. But on the last page, on number 7, it says the General Assembly may provide further instructions to its delegates and recall its delegates at any time for a breach of duty. Let me ask this. Can we add, and those delegates will be bound by these further instructions? Is there any problem with adding that? Because what I want, and you said that this body has a responsibility to all these constituents, everybody that's sitting in this audience and everywhere else. If we don't add that, and we just send somebody without that authority to bring them back so that they'll be bound by that, then we are going to be derelict in that responsibility, I'm afraid. So if there's no problem, if that doesn't mess this up, I'd like for us to consider that.
Yeah, there is no legal problem that would still aggregate. That's not a problem for you to add that language.
Okay. And let me ask you this question in y'all's knowledge, and I mean, we'll get our own legal advice, but in the event they didn't follow those additional duties, then at that point, that would be a breach of their duty and we could recall them is the way I read that. Would that be correct?
That is correct. There's a layer underneath that I think is important, just standard agency law. I'm now speaking as a lawyer, so forgive me for doing that. But under standard agency law, when you appoint somebody to act on your behalf, this is as true for the legislature as in business, the only authority they have is that which you give them. If they act outside that authority, any actions are null and void on its face, and you always retain the right to terminate an agency relationship. So even without that language, you retain all those rights as a legislature, but there's no problem with adding that language.
And I can appreciate that, but in a case like this, I just feel like it's cleaner, and if it's well-defined, that it would have more substance to it. So Senator Stubblefield, I would ask that somehow we can put that in so that I can be a yes.
Okay.
You first? Yes, sir. Senator Bond? Senator Hicks, turn your mic off, please.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Perfect. So Senator Stubblefield and I agree on the issue of the debt and deficit. And since I was pulled up, I'd taken a picture of the Arkansas Democrat news article that appeared on October 17, 2018, which showed our deficit is up 77% from 2015, 2016 until the end of the 2017, 2018 fiscal year. It's gone from $439 billion to $779 billion.
I just give you an update on that. It's now 1.2 billion this year.
And so
True.
It being nonpartisan, I understand it is a nonpartisan issue. I can't help myself but mention the last president who ran a balanced budget at the federal level was Bill Clinton from right here in Arkansas. And we, as a bipartisan group for years in Arkansas, have run balanced budgets over and over and over again due to our RSA statute. So there is a tremendous amount of concern over the budget from me and the deficit. But the question I've always had about the Article 5 convention is the restriction, and Senator Hickey, I think, is reaching at that in some of his questions, that they address certain things. I think the Constitution has served us too well just to open it up for total amendment. Can you restrict an Article 5 convention to just, say, spending issues or particular issues?
It is by definition limited to what the subject matter of the application. No amendment. First of all, the point of order kills any amendment that's outside that. So our Convention of States application has three areas. One, fiscal restraint by the federal government, scope and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits on both appointed and elected officials. So anything outside of that falls by a point of order, and if it doesn't fall by a point of order, it'll never go to the states because it'll be enjoined at the Secretary of the Senate and the Clerk of the House's level. They'll never send an amendment that's outside of aggregated application. So it won't happen. This is a limited process. It's not a constitutional convention. It's an amendments convention called for by the states. They're two very different things. And it's highly limited just in its scope based on its application. And you can't get around that. I mean, the people who are afraid say, well, they'll get around it.
That's me.
Yeah, but let me tell you, I've traveled almost as many states as Mark has. And the biggest disappointment I see in America is the lack of faith of one legislative body and some legislative body in another state. You know, North Dakota thinks the same way you do. New Hampshire thinks the same way. Matter of fact, Vermont thinks almost the same way you do, their legislature. Leave us alone. Let us be our state. Let us do this and limit yourself to what you're supposed to be doing. So I don't worry about that, but I think that's a lack of understanding of what the Article 5 process is and its approach and what the legal frameworks around that have already established in terms of pre-existing decisions.
Just one follow-up, because I can count, and it looks like there's 5 sponsors on the committee on the bill. So And this restriction issue is real to me from a legal standpoint. And that reading Article 5, I don't see that. I don't read the restrictions in Article 5 that you're telling me. I understand your position of how it couldn't happen, but I just don't see that in the Constitution is what I'm saying. I don't see those restrictions in the Constitution.
That's correct, Senator. And the Constitution is a document of guidance, not always specific substance. I think one of the best examples I can speak to as a lawyer is the idea of due process. You and I know that due process requires a jury of your peers. We also know that it requires a unanimous jury in criminal cases. You and I can't point to that in the United States Constitution. But we know what the intent of the founders was. We believe in the intent of the founders. We look to the original intent of the document, and then we look to history and practice. There's a long history and practice around these conventions. There were many conventions, 11 conventions, in fact, interstate conventions before 1787, all of them limited by the application for convention. We've just discovered the 39th interstate convention in American history, all of them limited by their resolutions, their applications. There's never been in all of American history any examples of a runaway convention, Article 5 or otherwise. There's never been an Article 5 convention, but we've had many, many interstate conventions. There are no examples of either delegates or conventions themselves running away. So there's a long history of this, and there's a long legal history prior to 1787 and subsequent to 1787 of how these conventions operate. And then finally, I would add that the best evidence that I can give you for these conventions staying on the rails is there have been over 400 applications for conventions to Congress to hold an Article 5 convention. Unless 34 of them are exactly the same and say that they are addressing the exact same subject matter, meaning they can't go outside their subject, you don't aggregate the necessary 2/3 states. So it's conclusive. Even Congress won't recognize anything that's outside the scope of a proposed convention.
Good. Senator Ballinger?
I don't think, my question's answered. Thank you.
Anyone else? Senator Stubfield, I want to ask you, we have 10 people who have signed up. I know many people have traveled from very far distances that have signed up to speak. We don't have time for all of them to speak. That would be 50 minutes, and we will adjourn before then. We have other people who have come to hear other bills that will not be heard today. Do you want any of these people to have traveled to speak for this, to be given the opportunity to speak for it?
Mr. Chairman, if we don't have the time, I would suggest we go ahead and call a vote.
Well, it's 11 o'clock. We go
Right.
into session at 11:30. I would adjourn somewhat before then, and again, because of some quality horse accident I had, I have a doctor's appointment.
Did you get a guarantee with that horse?
For the audience that don't know, on December the 17th, I was injured in a horseback riding incident on a horse that I bought from Senator Stubblefield. So to bring y'all to shed the light, the reason I talk about him being the purveyor of quality horse flesh. So we have a good laugh out of it, but I'm healthy today and I wasn't then, so I'm very thankful to be here. But I do not want to disrespect anyone who has traveled here, but we have basically run out of time. Are you going to amend your bill and bring it back? What Senator Hickey had? What?
I would be willing to, I will give you my word that we will amend the bill, but if we go ahead and vote on it, I will give you my word we will amend it.
Senator Sample.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to disagree with Senator Stubblefield, but public input is what we need. Okay. And so I'm not willing to vote on this bill unless we hear from all the people that are concerned on that list.
Okay. Senator Hester? No, you pass, you're good. Senator Hickey?
Since Senator Stubblefield asked me the question, and you know I trust you more than most. But this is so important, and we're so early in the thing. I would like for us to do it correct, or at least what I deem is correct, and have those amendments in here and send it the whole way the way it needs to be. So I would like to do that, and like I say, that's the only thing that I want to make sure of, is that whoever we send down there, if this was to ever happen, that this body that represents all of these people, that we have an avenue to pull to instruct them to do something in the event things get out of hand. I really want that to be correct when it comes out of this committee, and that's no disrespect for you, Senator. So it's just
in reality, if you change it, we're going to have to vote on it. So I mean, I go ahead.
And I think that is correct. I think our rules say that the amendment has to be in writing anyway.
The amendment has to be in writing. Yeah.
Right.
So. Okay. I will offer, of the 10 people who signed up to speak for the amendment, if there's anyone here who feels like they are being deprived of their right to speak, I would let you come to the table to speak. Thank you very much, and Representative Randy.
I've talked to several of these people, and our statements that we were going to make have been covered.
Very good.
Speaking for me, I don't.
Very, very good. And I do appreciate that. I will get with Senator Tester. We have other bills that take a lot more time than what this does, and we will get together and try to schedule, just like budget was canceled this morning. We could have started at 9. If we need to meet when session is called 11:30, if we want to meet in the afternoon, we'll get together and try to schedule that. Representative Davis, in all respect to you and the people that come to do this, your bills need to be heard, and so we'll try to get together and work the logistics of additional hours out and do this to do it and get this heard. So, Senator Stubbsfield, you want to pull your bill down to amend it?
I will.
Okay. Very good. So there will be no vote, no action taken on that. I appreciate everyone coming out. It's a good crowd, lots of strange faces. Every time I go and speak to a school or a civic organization, I tell everyone that the Capitol is a public building. It's just like your city hall or your library. It's yours. Please come. Please participate. And I thank you for doing that, Senator Sample.
Mr. Chair, are we going to hear the people that signed up to speak, or are we asking them to come back, which I think is a very bad idea?
When we meet again and it's posted again, if you want to come back and speak, you will have the full right to come and do that. Please do. Yes. And I'm not trying to cut you off on that. Today is an issue because session starts at 11:30, and it's 11:05 right now, and there'll be things to have to do, and I really need to leave by 11:15. So, but Senator Sample, there's 10 people signed up. We give them 5 minutes. We're looking at 50 minutes if they took their full 5 minutes to do that. So, but y'all are welcome to come back at the next meeting when the bill has been amended and be presented again. You're welcome to come back and speak, and we will give you your time. Okay. Senator Tester, I apologize that we've run out of time today, but okay, that's fine. But we'll get together and make time. Okay? We're adjourned.
Senator Stubblefield, are you ready to present your bill?
Yes.
Or your amendment?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Everybody has a copy of the amendment? I'm willing to take any questions. Very simple amendment.
Anybody have questions? Seeing no questions, we can move to adopt this amendment to the bill. I'll take a motion. We're going to wait whenever we get to that point. I'll explain what's going on. But this is just for the amendment itself.
I make a motion that we receive the amendment.
Senator Hester makes a motion. Senator Ballinger makes the second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Senator Stubblefield, you're ready to present your bill as amended.
Also, I want to note that the amendment also added Senator Mark Johnson as a co-sponsor, okay? To make sure everybody knew that. Listen, we presented the bill this morning in its entirety, and if anybody in the committee has any questions, willing to take them.
Okay. Take a moment of personal privilege. Senator Samples allowed this meeting to happen because he wanted to be recorded as a no vote. We checked with the staff attorneys, and they said that you have to be present in order to be recorded as a no vote. So we have a decision to make as a committee. Obviously, a not voting is the same as a no vote, but Senator Samples was pretty explicit that in the record he would like it reflected as a no vote. So I'm taking any ideas from the committee. I believe technically, if we want to, I wonder if we could change the rules to allow it within our rules, or if that's the best course of action. Go ahead.
I'd make a motion that that we temporarily suspend the rules to allow a no vote to be recorded for a colleague for purposes of recording a vote on a meeting of short notice like this.
That's a good motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Thank you. So we're on SJR 3. I will entertain a motion to adopt it as amended. Senator Ballinger had the motion. Senator Davis had the second. Any question or comments? Yes, ma'am. All those in favor say yay. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, we'll do a roll call vote since we want to record Senator Samples on the record.
Senator Sample? Senator Sample?
No.
Senator Hickey?
Yes.
Senator Hester?
Yes.
Senator Bond?
No.
Senator Davis?
Yes.
Senator Ballinger?
Yes.
Yes. Senator, with 5 votes, your bill passed as amended. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee.
Anything with nothing else before the committee, this committee is adjourned.